everyone, and welcome to episode 142 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm Danièle Sobolski, also known as the 5-Minute Medievalist. If you've come across my work before, you'll know that one of the things I love to learn about and talk about is filth. Not just the R-rated stuff, although that's also super fun, but the actual everyday management of keeping bodies, clothing, objects, and places clean in the Middle Ages. How much did people actually care about cleanliness? How did they manage it without an endless supply of hot water? And if you time traveled back to a medieval city, what would it be like? This week, I spoke with Dr. Emily Hutchison about one of my favorite subjects, sanitation. Emily is an associate professor of history at Mount Royal University, whose work focuses on medieval Paris, its politics, its crime, its sexuality, and lately, its sanitation practices. In addition to her many scholarly articles on the City of Light, Emily has just created a story map called Anti-Pollution Measures and the Common Good in Medieval Paris, which is online and available to all. Our conversation on just how dirty medieval Paris was and who was responsible for cleaning up the streets is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, Emily, for coming on to talk to us about sanitation in Paris. This is a topic that I really enjoy, actually, so this is great for me to have you on the podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Thanks. Well, I don't always ask people their origin stories when it comes to research, but I do want to ask you that question. How did you get interested in sanitation, of all things?
Actually, it's been a very long journey to get here. I started a few years ago researching Parisian spaces. I'm really interested in that. And so I'm writing a book actually on gender, space, and agency. But initially when I started, I was just looking at Parisian spaces, and I was really interested in life at street level. And, so the more research I did, the more I was cognizant that it's really important to understand sort of the environmental footprint of the city. And naturally, that means issues relating to sanitation, pollution, but also I was really interested at the time in resource acquisition and where resources were going, how they were coming in, and so forth. I was really interested initially in kind of thinking, because I was looking at Paris from the perspective of the street and people's everyday activities and so on. I was really interested in a number of the ordinances that I was coming across that dealt with pollution matters. And I was aware actually that there was quite a literature on that outside of Paris, right? So Guy Geltner, for example, has that amazing book, Roads to Health. Jenna Koemens has written a number of articles and essays. I think there's a book forthcoming, if it hasn't already been published as well, on the King of Dirt, which is a really, really great article. So I was really I loved the literature that was coming out. And it's such an important topic, I think, so timely for us in this present moment. I found very little, though, on Paris. And what I did find, of course, was in French. So it was really hard for me to introduce that to my students. Simultaneously, I should also add teaching a course on medieval Paris. And so I was just going through these ordinances that related to sanitation, and I wanted to learn more about it. And that's kind of how I ended up here.
I love how that happens as kind of a confluence of events, because I think we're always pressured to know what we're going to study, from the time you're in elementary school. You need to know what you're going to do when you grow up. And usually it's serendipity. So I love that, how it came together. Okay, so there is this really entrenched idea that medieval people loved mud and blood, and they just wallowed in the mud all the time. I mean, that scene from Monty Python where they're just collecting the filth. It's such a common idea. So tell us, is that true? Do people actually enjoy mud and blood and just wallowing in filth all the time?
No, of course not. I love that scene too that you're referring to. No, of course not. What we do know about the streets of Paris, just like most urban centers, is that they're very narrow. Some of them were paved and some were not. So they did get muddy. And oftentimes they were sloped, so the stream would run through the center of the street. And sometimes that carried with it excrement and human waste and animal waste and food waste and all other kinds of things. And there are many primary sources from the period that indicate that a lot of those streets were problematic. But people complained about it, not just the king and the royal council. And one of the things that I found in this project is that there were lots of different mechanisms to try to deal with that problem and to deal with it on a regular basis, so that the streets were as clear as they possibly could be, and that people were conditioned to bring their waste to the dumping sites and so on and so forth. So while there is, a grain of truth to it, that the city was probably quite smelly and some areas were more murky than others, very dark and narrow in some cases, I think the bulk of people didn't want to live in those kinds of conditions, and they did what they could to make sure that they could move through the city with ease. They could sell their wares in their boutiques, along the streets, in the marketplaces, without having to wade through, knee-deep mud.
I think that's absolutely true, but we needed to say it.
Absolutely.
And the thinking behind it is beyond just, oh, that's gross, we don't want to step in it. Why was it so important to people across medieval Europe, but especially in Paris, because that's what you're studying? Why was it important to them to have clean streets? Like beyond just walking through the streets, there were health reasons too.
Yeah,
Right?
of course. Yeah. And one of the things that the research is showing is that people were pretty cognizant of the health theories that were circulating. And they understood, which is quite logical, that waste that was running free was problematic, right? Of course, there was no germ theory, but the theory of miasma was really predominant in that time. So then the idea that noxious smells could cause ill health, infection, and pestilence was something that was really current. And so they understood that. And they also understood the impact of infected water, right? So if water is polluted, then it's going to cause ill health. It wasn't just the royal government or the civic government in Paris that was really concerned with that. There is some evidence to show that those ideas were circulating at street level, and people understood the importance of keeping not just their roadways clear, but their water systems really clear of those pollutants that would lead to infection. And, one of the things that I found in my research that I put in the Storymap is the first half of it kind of deals with royal ordinances that were published in many different squares throughout the city over and over again, which repeated these ideas, right, that connected pollution to infection. So, even if people didn't really understand the quote unquote science of it, at the very least, this was being repeated over and over, perhaps conditioning at least some of them to accept that 1 + 1 = 2. I think that people's interest in public health probably outweighed the logistics of moving freely throughout the city. But at the very least, in the ordinances, they're sort of presented as equally important, right? Economic vitality of the city, free moving streets where people and goods and products and services can exist unhindered was put on equal par with people's good health, people and animals.
Yeah. I mean, you want to have a two-pronged approach, right? If you can't get people interested on a public health side, get them interested on the money side. And that, as it comes out of my mouth, sounds so relevant to today. It's not even funny.
Yeah. I was thinking the same thing about COVID this morning, actually. Like the two-pronged approach is as important now, I guess, as it was back then.
Yeah, absolutely.
Some things capture people's interest more than others. And I guess governments have to recognize that and negotiate that even in the Middle Ages.
Yeah, you have to appeal to both. This recognition of human motivation is really interesting. I think it's something that you can find in your Storymap. And one of the interesting quotes you had there too was, it was a miracle that more people weren't sick. That more people weren't sick by getting water out of the Seine. I mean, they did have public fountains, so I'm wondering if that's kind of hyperbolic, how many people are actually dragging their buckets to the Seine. But it was interesting how carefully they thought about that connection between pollution and health.
You're right. I mean, there were public fountains. One of the things I did include in the Storymap is there was an ordinance that I came across that was discussing two things about the water system that brought water from the outside of Paris into the fountains. So they had piping and so on. The ordinance is dealing with the wealthy people who are diverting some of that clean water to their own properties. And so he's trying to put a stop to that. But also that in preventing that water from joining up to the fountains in the city, that people are being forced to go to the river and take that water. And that was a big problem. So that was, just you saying that reminded me of that one ordinance I didn't have time to include in this already very lengthy, probably way too long first study on Parisian sanitation.
Well, now you've told people, so now we know. Okay, so we're talking about ordinances coming down from the king, and he's posting them and he's having them cried out at different marketplaces and things like that. What is he asking the people to do? What are these about?
Yeah, so one of the most important orders is to make sure that everybody cleans the street in front of their homes right? So just like here in Canada, we have, we're all responsible for cleaning the snow and the ice off of our sidewalks. So it's along those lines. It's a little unclear if he's referring to people who own those properties, like landlords, or people who are inhabiting them. But I suspect that, when I've read probably about 30 of these ordinances, it seems to be targeting the landlords, which makes a lot of sense, but I can't confirm that. But yeah, the responsibility is on each and every citizen of the city. And he's very clear in the ordinances that it doesn't matter what your status, whether you're a high nobleman, a member of the clergy, a scholar from the University of Paris, or just an average person, that everybody is equally responsible for cleaning the streets in front of their residences. The residences, their property, and their gardens, it says. What they meant was that you're responsible for cleaning it, but also taking that refuse outside to the designated dumping zones. And there were systems in place for taking care of that. There were carters who could be hired to remove that waste for the neighborhood's behalf. And one of the things I found is that the neighborhoods would pitch in. They would pitch in a certain amount of money that would cover the costs of waste removal. So that was one of the first things. There were also ordinances about not dumping out of windows, right? So not only do you have to keep the stoop in the street clear, but you can't dump anything out of windows. You are not permitted to dump any kind of human or animal waste in the river systems, either the Seine or the Bièvre. No dumping in the ditches of Paris, right? So around the walls, as I said, there are specific zones for dumping, dumps, I guess, or slag heaps, and you're meant to carry all of those out in one fashion or another, either by hiring a carter or yourself. There were some other things about markets, like you're not allowed to obstruct the street with your stall, right? So if you're, for example, not just in the biggest market of the city, the Halles, where you would rent a space, but a lot of people would have their homes and boutiques on the street level. And there were rules about how far out the tablets or the tables could go, the windowsills. So there were allegedly strict rules about that. I don't know how well they were policed, but the rules are very clear that they can't bleed out onto the street and prevent people from moving, or that would add to that waste piling up around it.
One of the things I liked about the section that you did on the Halles was that it was saying there are too many people that are selling stuff outside their houses. We need to sell them in the marketplace. Oh, and by the way, that helps us get inspection taxes and stuff from them as well. So it was kind of a little glimpse into the fact that people are working around the system by kind of selling in a place where they hope the inspectors are not going to find them.
Yeah, exactly. Very clever.
Okay, so tell us a little bit more about the carters, because you have some interesting stories about the carters. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting as a Canadian is seeing that the carters are named voiturier, because the cars are called voiture, right? Unless you're in Canada, and then you might call it a char. But tell us a little bit about the carters. What was their responsibility, and how do they sometimes not meet that?
Yeah. So the carters, it's a profession that you can find elsewhere, not just related to sanitation, but men who have carts with a horse or several horses who can be hired to carry whatever. So for example, just an aside, I have a trial record from Paris where a carter was hired by a woman to leave the city of Paris with her and just outside the city and help her daughter move her belongings and her furniture to Paris. So carters could be hired for anything, but where sanitation was concerned, there were voiturier carters whose work was specifically to remove that waste. And what would happen typically is individuals, or most often neighborhoods, would hire a carter, and they had particular salaries based on how far they had to go with the cart to the dumping zones. So there's very clear that, the closer you are to the dumping zones, the less you have to pay the carter, obviously. So there are rules about how deep their cart should be and how high the backstop needs to be at the bottom of the cart, because in numerous cases, residents complained that they would overfill their carts, and then the waste would dump out of the back. And so then they would try to get their carter to come back and fix the problem, and he refused, and so on and so forth. So lots of really interesting problems that were emerging. So the king tries to deal with that and specifies, carts have to be this size, and you can only put this much waste in, and so on and so forth. That was their charge. And thanks to Katja Weidenfeld, we have this really great trial that was brought to the Parliament of Paris We don't really know the outcome because it doesn't state the outcome, but where a carter and the man who hired the carter are at odds over the salary. They had agreed on a set price. The neighborhood was contributing to the salary, but he said that he had carried out 50-something carts of waste, and the man who hired him said that he had only taken out, I think, 33 or something along that line. And so they had a dispute over the salary that he was given ultimately. So that was in the mid 15th century. What else do we know about them? Well, we know also that in 1415, the king issued an ordinance trying to incentivize carters to come back to sanitation, because the ordinance claimed anyway that they were too busy doing other things, especially for the royal family and members of the royal court, including administrators. And so he was trying to incentivize them by removing any fiscal responsibilities to the city, no taxes. They would have to pay hereafter no taxes at all. And they would be free from the night watch, which is a really great privilege. So he's really trying to incentivize those individuals to come back to the fold, presumably because there were problems, I guess. We don't know exactly why that ordinance was issued, but he said that the streets were becoming a little bit overwrought with waste and so on. So that's what we know about the background and salaries and so on. But again, one of the great series of sources that Katja Weidenfeld has shared with readers in her book from 1996 is a series of arrests that were made between the early 15th century and the mid 16th century, various jurisdictions in Paris, where among those who were caught in the act were carters who were not dumping the waste that they had accumulated in their carts. They were dumping them elsewhere and not in the designated dumping zones. So they were fined not as much as they were supposed to be fined in many cases. And also they were told to clean it up. So best not all carters were following the rules.
My favorite one of those examples is the one where a carter appears to have been paid to dump a whole bunch of waste outside of someone else's house.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And so you wonder what's going on there. I mean, is that a neighborhood dispute? And there's also not carters, but these two women also, I don't know if you recall, but two women were caught continuously dumping the waste from they were chambermaids where they were working in front of a particular individual's house. So, we don't know enough about these, but it's really interesting to sort of think about the dynamics that are going on behind this. Like, is this feuds that are ongoing between neighbors, or are there other reasons for these acts of what appear, at least superficially, as acts of vengeance or acts of aggression anyway? It's quite comical.
Yeah, exactly. From this distance is comical.
Yeah.
But at the time, people took it so seriously, because I remember it's probably somewhere in Carol Rockcliffe's work. I think it was in York. Somebody got beaten to death over having garbage in front of their house or someone else's house. And people just lost it. There is another example that I think Peter Konechny mentioned on a podcast episode we did about crime in London, where some apprentices beat someone to death over garbage left in front of somebody's house or workshop. It must have been a workshop with these apprentices. So people were taking this really seriously because there were consequences for if you didn't clean up, right? So what were some of the consequences that people would meet if they didn't clean up their area in front of their house?
Sure. The ordinances are very clear that the fines are high, right? The fines fluctuate between 40 sous parisis and 60 sous parisis, which is not an unsubstantial amount of money. And oftentimes it involves imprisonment. It doesn't say for how long, but imprisonment on bread and water could be a few days, could be a few weeks. It's not clear. But between the fines and the imprisonment, those are quite steep punishments. But what we find when we actually drill down to the people who are caught, a lot of times the fine that they paid isn't stipulated. Actually, it's not declared, but the fines were a fraction. The ones that were declared were a fraction of what was actually ordered by the king. So in the case of those chambermaids, I can't quite remember, but it was a very small amount of money that they were asked to pay, and they were supposed to clean it up, right? So all of the people who were caught, who were delinquents, were ordered to clean it up. But as I said, the fines were a lot lower than they were supposed to be. But I did want to say, another reason why they would take it seriously is not just the threat of a 40 sous parisis fine or a 60 sous parisis fine plus imprisonment, but it was also, I think, the health concerns. Also, potentially even the reputation of those people. So if you're, back to those apprentices, it makes sense that to them, if somebody's leaving professional waste outside of their shop, that is likely going to look back on them or reflect back on them and the master of whatever trade that was. And, they could pay fines. I don't know what York or London's rules were, but certainly in Paris, if you weren't obeying the guild laws, not only did you have to deal with potentially the fines from the city or the king about waste, but then you might also have to pay a fine to the guild for not cleaning up your messes and compromising the quality of the trade. So I think that, a lot of people were really concerned with those kinds of things and reputation. But then on top of that, there's the smell and there's the appearance and, there's the threats to their health. So I think the point you raise is really important. And even if the records aren't totally clear about people's uptake and commitment to the common good and to public health, I think that there are some clues that we can pull out that sort of indicate how important this really was to them. These are their everyday lives. Like, this is the health and well-being of their children, of their workers, of, their wives and their mothers. So I think it's really, really important that we remember these are real people who are dealing with, in some cases, really delinquent, annoying neighbors. And I'm sure frustrations did boil over quite a lot. One of the pieces of evidence that I included was someone was walking and someone dumped waste out of his home and it fell on his head and it finds its way to court and he has to pay the price and so on and so forth. But there's a very specific series of ordinances about not dumping out of windows. So that was in direct contravention of those rules. But let's just pause and imagine the horror, right? I mean, the horror.
Yeah.
Whether it's human waste or food waste, doesn't matter, or even just dirty water, like that would be a horrific experience. And you can just imagine how that might play out in the streets. And oftentimes I think as historians of the Middle Ages, it's easy to forget because it's so far in the distance. It's easy to forget about human interaction when we're telling history, the histories of these people. But I think it's really important to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. The human element is so important when you're talking about things like basic sanitation. I think one of the other examples that you have in the story map is that someone was asked to clean something up and they punched the official in the face.
Oh, right. That's right.
And you think it could happen. It could happen today where someone says clean that up and it escalates, but it also could be an indication of this bad blood that had been existing for a long time. So it's very complex, these very human interactions about it, which brings me to ask you, who's in charge of these fines? Because there's some incentive for reporting people for having dirty areas in front of their houses or dirty streets. So who's in charge of all of this?
So Paris is a patchwork of jurisdictions. And in this story map of mine, I focused just on the king's jurisdiction and in cooperation with the city. So the Hôtel de Ville, the home of the city's government, they worked with the king very closely in regulating this. So every jurisdiction, whether we're talking about the king's jurisdiction or the jurisdiction of Saint-Martin-des-Champs, which is an abbey in the north of Paris, they had in their employ people who are called voyers. And it's not something I talk about in the story map, but it is a really important element. So the voyers were basically like overseers, like the superintendents of the streets, if you want. So their role was to keep track of the streets and to make sure that they were in good repair and to sort of watch how the waste was accumulating and so on and so forth. So they would be the ones who technically would seek people out and report on them. But there were mechanisms in place we can see for informing. So for example, there's an ordinance about not polluting in the Seine River, something I mentioned towards the end of the story map. So it's very clear that the fine is really high. So it's 60 sous parisis plus 4 times the expense of cleaning the river that individual would have to pay. And in that ordinance, there's an incentive for neighbors to report to the voyer or to the sergeants under the provost of Paris, who was the king's main judicial representative in the city. So there were these incentives like that we can glimpse in a number of different ordinances where, it's very clearly asking people to inform. So the voyer, or in some cases, another individual who might be assigned the task of supervising. If, for example, I include some information about Place Maubert, that's on the left bank of Paris. An individual, a sergeant of the king, actually was given the responsibility to check on this instead of a voyer. And I don't really know what explains that, why the sergeant was picked over a voyer, but he was incentivized with a quarter of the proceeds of the fine. So the king would take 3/4 and the sergeant would take 1/4. And then on top of that, in Place Maubert, there were 2 individuals from the neighborhood who were appointed, I should say, to supervise the neighborhood and to make sure that Place Maubert was kept clean in the ways that it was specified. And instead of incentivizing them with income, they were incentivized with heavy fines, right? So in this case, it's more of a stick. So they were to police their friends and neighbors, probably also rivals within that space, and report to the sergeant, who would report then to the king or the king's representatives. So that's kind of how it worked. There wasn't one way that it worked, but there were people in place who were charged with overseeing the whole thing and making sure that people were doing what they were doing and bringing them to the Châtelet, which was the main prison of the city and the home of the provost of Paris. So they would bring those people there when they were caught in the act and so on.
I think that those incentives are part of the reason why it seems to have worked pretty well, because I think some of the arrests that you have in the Storymap, for example, show that people are trying to get rid of their waste under the cover of night, or they dump really close to the edges of the city, but they don't make it all the way to the dump. So there seems to be this effort made to hide what they're doing, in part, I would think, because of not just punishments or, even incentives, but because of shame. And that's something that you mentioned as well. These ordinances are couched in a language that suggests it's only reasonable to keep your streets clean. And it's only reasonable. So only reasonable men are the people who are going to be keeping stuff clean. And if you don't keep your stuff clean, well, what does that say about you? Can you tell us about why they use this language?
One of the reasons I think that they use that kind of language is that royal ordinances in general, even if they're not about issues related to sanitation, they frame everything as a duty to the common good, right? So sanitation measures that they put in place are also, they fall on the responsibilities of the whole community, the king, the voyer, the sergeants, and also the citizens of the realm. So everybody has this common interest to preserve the health and vitality of the city. And so we see often in the language of the ordinances, this reference back to the health of the common good, the health of the city. And part of that is about good order and good government of the city. So good order and good policing. But policing at that time, like bonne police, means more like good order. And so they always connected those things to reason and logic. And everything that kind of fell outside of that purview was considered to be irrational. And if you were sort of one of those irrational people who was compromising the health of the community, then the idea, at least that's embedded in the ordinances, is that that individual should be stigmatized, right? With the high fine, with the imprisonment in some cases, and so on and so forth, right? That they would also be held responsible for cleaning it up. And I think that one of the motivations for them there is to really get people to commit to this sense of community. Paris was the largest city in Western Europe at that time. So we're talking about somewhere in the range of 150,000 to 200,000 people around that time, around 1400. And, it's a city of migrants, many of whom don't have strong connections with people. They're moving around the city and so on. So I think that there was, to some extent, some extra concerted effort to try to build this notion of community, at least by the king, right? I'm not saying that there was something that was felt at street level, but I do think that there's this impetus to try to create a sense of community within that large city space, right? It's not like a village where everybody, knows each other, they're related, they're friends, their families go back generations. This is a city primarily of migrants. So I think that they had a lot of extra work to do. And so they really, in my opinion, try to force the issue and try to get people to commit to this notion of community. So they create this line between the rational members of the community who are contributing to the good of all, the good of the economy, but the good of the health of the community. And they stigmatize those who aren't willing to contribute as irrational, almost criminal-like people.
I think that's really interesting in this particular context because a couple of weeks ago on the podcast, we were talking about the Jacquerie. And it's interesting that this is Charles VI, who had some issues with Paris. Paris is in arms against him at least once. And so creating this idea of having everybody pulling together in Paris, everyone having a communal identity as being Parisians, no matter, where you're from. Paris is really an entity unto itself. And I think he kind of has an afterthought being the countryside as well. But I think it's really interesting in the context of this being Charles VI, who has had issues with Paris before, who's working towards building this community there that will support him and hopefully pull together.
Yeah, I mean, so the Jacquerie was certainly in living memory, as was the Black Death, we should also say. His father had to deal with the Jacques, but Charles VI, he came to the throne in 1380 and he was still a child, more like a teenager. But 2 years into his reign, he had to deal with a revolt in Paris, quite a violent one, as they tend to be. And I think you're right. Like, I do think that there was this desire for him to kind of smooth things over and to make sure that there was a connection with his people. As soon as he comes of age, right, in 1388, and emancipates himself from his regency council, that's when we see these ordinances multiplying, right? So it's from 1388 onwards up until about 1405, where we see these constantly being issued and reissued. It's not to say there weren't ordinances that didn't survive before that and after 1405 in greater numbers, but unfortunately we don't have any evidence of that. But the uptick in 1388, it is something to think about. He was known as Charles le Bien-Aimé, the well-loved. And I do think that there was an attempt for him to continue to grow that relationship with the city. Another thing to know about the context politically is that there was a pretty massive civil war that began in 1411, but it traces its origins earlier, back to 1405, even 1404, just at the time when Charles VI's ordinances start diminishing in number. And one of the things that some of the work that I've done in the past on the Civil War kind of points to is that Parisians were really, really politically involved. Like, they were really active. And the Civil War, initially started between two noblemen, two relatives of the king, but it quickly bled out into the city of Paris as its first stage, in which the violence and the conflict unfolded. And Parisians were really involved. And so back, why is this all relevant? Well, I do think it's something to think about. I would want to think about it a little bit more fully, but it seems to me that he's attempting to build this community, this sense of community with the city, and to show that he is a king who cares about his citizens and so on and so forth. And, this is one way that he wants to ensure that their well-being is protected and the common good is protected and so on and so forth.
Yeah, and it seems to have worked if he's Charles the Well-Loved.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to switch gears. For the people who are listening to this as teachers, educators, tell us a little bit about why you chose Storymap as the way to tell this story and how it worked for you. Was it something that you liked and would do again? Tell us about using Storymap to tell this kind of story.
Thank you for that question. I love story maps and I'm going to be using them again. Absolutely. The reason I chose this format for the first publication on this topic is that I was doing this project on Paris, as I mentioned at the beginning, and I was teaching a course to undergraduates, second-year students on the city of Paris. And, it's actually really tricky to find a lot of secondary and primary sources in English because not very many have been translated, and the bulk of the historiography is written by French scholars in French. So it was really difficult for me to find source material to give to her, and I was doing a lot of translation in my classes to give them sources to work with. And so I was teaching that course while I was working on this project, slowly but surely. And towards the end of the semester, I had put this topic on my list, my syllabus, my to-do list. And I just wanted to make something for them, actually. That's where I got the idea. And so I tried different things and nothing was really working. I was trying to put a website together, but it was too complicated. And then I found out about story maps, and I just started with my research assistant, Christopher Rancière, who's a co-author on this. We started putting this together with the idea being that I would have, very scholarly piece, even if it's not peer reviewed at this stage, but a very scholarly piece that includes a lot of primary source evidence that I translate and make available to them alongside images and mapping. And that way I was finding that they're a little bit more invested when they were feeling like they could relate to the space. That was a course where I was doing a lot of interactive things. Like I did a VR tour of Paris, connecting old spaces to new and so on. Yeah, so I wanted them to feel part of the space and to really understand it. So I just wanted to have a lot of visuals to go alongside the text. And the story map seemed the best way of presenting that information. And so I wrote it actually with my students in mind. They were my target audience. It was really, really straightforward. Story maps are amazing tools for both educators and I think students. Students can pick them up really, really easily. It's basically a series of slides that you put together, and you can add text, images, maps, modern maps that you can connect with, videos, GIFs, podcasts, whatever. You can download any media into these, and you can have that media alongside text. And it's just a really, really great tool. It's very easy to learn, very intuitive, and students love the final product. Aesthetically, story maps, I'm not sure if they can be beat at this stage. They're really, really easy to use and they're beautiful.
Well, it was really great to see such big maps. It's something you can't really have in an academic book all that easily. They're usually in black and white and kind of grainy. So it was nice to see the research that you'd done on an actual map on the screen, which was really helpful for me to visualize what you were talking about. So
great. That was my goal. So I'm glad to hear that.
Well, I hope that lots of people are going to check out this story map now because it's open for everyone to see. And they can learn more about Paris from this and sanitation. Thank you so much, Emily, for joining us to talk to us about sanitation in Paris.
It was my pleasure. I'm just really happy to be here. So thank you for inviting me.
To find out more about Emily's work, you can follow her on Twitter at Emily J. Hutchison. You can also find her at Mount Royal University by doing a quick search at mtroyal.ca, where the faculty links are way too long to say aloud on a podcast. Her story map has a numeric URL, so here's a bit.ly version for you. bit.ly/3, capital L, small y, small v, capital Q, small j, small q. We'll also have these links for you in the show notes on medievalist.net, of course. Emily's story map is called Anti-Pollution Measures and the Common Good in Medieval Paris. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website this week. What's going on, Peter?
Hey. Yeah, we've got like a slew of new content. Some really fun stuff. We have a piece from one of your friends and former guests, Christine Morgan.
Yeah.
She's writing about St. Anne, who's like every medieval Christian's favorite grandmother.
Yeah. I love Christine and I love St. Anne, so it's going to be awesome.
So we have another Christine Axon, who's talking about kissing in the Middle Ages.
Nice.
So that's coming up around the 14th. We've got Yov Tosh, who's talking about 10 tips for reading an Icelandic saga.
Ooh.
So I always love these like Icelandic sagas. They're fun to read. So maybe give you a nice little guide to get you into them.
Awesome. That sounds great.
And one more thing, we have a new columnist coming on board. His name is Jack Wilson, and he's going to be like our Mongol writer. He has this really wonderful YouTube channel called the Jack Meister. So he talks about all things Mongols. So I kind of found him through that. And I said, right for us. So we have his first piece coming this week as well. So I got a busy time getting all these posts out.
Yeah, and there's going to be something for absolutely everybody. That sounds amazing. Thanks, Peter.
Yeah. Thanks.
This November saw the publication of my new book, How to Live Like a Monk, Medieval Wisdom for Modern Life. So I think it's about time for a fashionably late launch. Join historian extraordinaire Helen Castor and me on Friday, February 25th at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, live on my social media channels as we chat about the book, take your questions, and give away some prizes. I'll also be making a special announcement that day, so be there or be square. Catch it all on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter at 5MIN Medievalist. Thank you to everyone who supports the Medieval Podcast and Medievalist.net's other work on Patreon. In addition to ad-free options for this podcast and for the website, there's plenty of other amazing stuff for patrons like subscriptions to Medieval Warfare magazine and the Medieval magazine, a book club, and exclusive maps by Tina Ross. To find out how to lend your support, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from filth to faith, follow medievalist.net on Facebook or Twitter @medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cebulski, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores, where you can get hold of How to Live Like a Monk in hardcover, ebook, and audiobook. Our music is Beyond the Warriors by Geefrog. Thanks for listening, and have yourself a wonderful day.